opinion, who is co-founder and CEO of Share-Through.
appssavvy.
appssavvy. It was a rough night.
You want me to moderate?
Actually, Chris was going to do that. That's what we're going to do next. Okay. And then we have Vejay Lalla, who is a partner and one of the leads in the entertainment and advertising and promotion practice. One of the foremost attorneys covering this new digital media. He's been a regular contributor to MediaPost, and he's going to take kind of an authoritative position on this panel.
That means attorney.
And then we have Chris Schreiber, who's VP Communications at Share-Through and was with Google before that, so he has some chops. So despite that awkward intro, because I do that because then I get the sympathy from the crowd. And speaking of sympathy, we did have a fifth participant, Stephan Goss from Zeeto, but he couldn't make it because he got really, really sick. But he provided me some notes, and I'm going to try and introduce his point of view because he has some very practical knowledge on the subject. But just let me go back quickly and to give you the etymology. And I know that word will put everybody to sleep, but it's actually what Mashable used to describe native advertising and its evolution. So I only started hearing this term about a year ago, and it was from some pretty big publishers who were coming to me to say, wow, we have these really cool new native advertising formats. So when they say that, I assume this is industry vernacular that people have been using forever, and I never challenge them on that. So I was like, great, now that's another thing for me to go back and figure out. But then, since then, I saw new and new forms and pitches coming to me of native. So I decided before this panel to actually go back and research where it came from. As it turns out, it's only like a year and a half old. And it started, ironically, at a MediaPost event in the fall of 2012 at our OMA conference when Fred Wilson from Union Square gave a keynote, and he used the phrase native monetization. And Chris's boss at Share-Through did a follow-up blog on it and really kind of coined the term native. It's not working well. That's my emergency number. Kind of coined the term native advertising and native advertising formats. And I think what's happened since then is there's been kind of a gold rush around this. Because, and this is going to be, I'm going to dispense with this quickly because I do have, normally I'm neutral, but I do have a very distinct editorial point of view on this subject, and I just want to get it out of the way. Because we're in this very awkward economic period for our industry where publishers, not just in digital, but all across the board, have been hobbled by economics and the shifts that are going on. And they're really seeking new formats and new advertising revenues and, as Fred Wilson would say, monetizations. And I think brands have taken the leverage and agencies have taken the leverage with this to break a lot of walls down that existed for many, many years. And I don't want to sound like an old fart, but I think those lines are really important. And for all the years I've been practicing in media, there have been very specific guidelines separating editorial content from advertising. Mostly, the only guidelines for this have been distributed by the ASME, the American Society of Magazine Editors, and the MPA. And it's very simple, and I know Vejay will follow up on this, but basically, you just need to disclose, and it needs to be very evident to the reader or the consumer, you know, which part is paid for and which part is organic, what we would call an editorial native, you know, the real stuff. And I think what's happening now is we're trying to push that envelope. And my concern isn't just for the church and state of advertising and editorial, and it's not even just for our industry. I think like if we break down those rules, it's going to have an impact on society that's much bigger than the economics of digital advertising and media. And I just want to get that out of the way. So the big question that we need to start with is really defining what the boundaries of native are. And I'd like to open up by asking each of the panelists to introduce themselves and giving a little specific definition of what they think the parameters of native are or are not.
Great, thanks, Joe. So Ari Brandt, CEO, co-founder of MediaBrix. So my point of view on native is frankly in line with BIA, Kelsey, eMarketer, Forrester, Harris Interactive, all the big major research that's been done out there. I believe native is branded content, whether it be a video or words, and that branded content is in stream, in social. So it's a sponsored story on Facebook, it's a promoted tweet on Twitter, and in the case of like the New York Times or Forbes.com, which I know ShareThrough works with, it's creating sponsored content modules. And all of this, in my opinion, the intent is to blend into the editorial experience. And ultimately, again, this is where I'm a dissenter on this, it's ultimately intended to deceive the user and quote unquote trick them into engaging in content that they think is real content.
Great. And for the rest of the panel, you'll be known as Chris C, and you'll be known as Chris S.
Great. So Chris with appssavvy. We think about it less as, I mean, the term has actually been around since the birth of the internet. It's right now it's more about something to rally around as an industry as far as companies that are trying to make advertising better, which we've been trying to do for 5 years, being one of the first to kind of trailblaze brands into Facebook apps and games in early 08, 9, and so on. And from a native perspective, we view it as there's two sides of the coin. There's the one side that Ari called out, which is the content side. That's more the what ShareThrough and BuzzFeed are doing. And I think that's an effective form of advertising. That's sponsored stories, that's Facebook. But I don't see it as deceiving. I think as long as there are clear lines as relates to the user experience, it can be very effective advertising. And I think the fact that some of these companies have creative shops internally, they're actually going to help ensure that the advertising is in line with the brand messaging. But the other side of the coin is where our company sits, which is helping publishers create new inventory based on what people do, which we call activity or native activity. But the way that the ad is triggered is at a point where a user is receptive, they see it, there's context. If there wasn't context, such as, thank you for sharing or congratulations in this game, then I would actually say that maybe it would just be a standard ad placement. But the way that we're building our business is more focused on making sure the user knows why it's there. So I see there's two sides. I see it as the content side, and I see it as ad side. And quite frankly, the side that we're on is what Twitter's business is all about. Twitter's my favorite example as far as a company that's proving that native advertising beyond content is working really well. The native ad product is a tweet. And they've built, I guess $140 million in mobile this year. Maybe their aggregate revenue is $400 million. And those guys are using the natural behavior of what people do to trigger ads. What native is not is a traditional ad placement, standard display.
Hi, I'm Vejay, Lalla. I thought you were going to play scary music when you announced me as the lawyer in the group, but maybe that's at the end. So it's kind of nice to sit in the middle of this conversation. I'm not going to get into the argument of what native is in terms of a definition, but I can kind of, as this panel goes on, talk about the different areas where I see, sort of the legal ramifications of it. When you talk about native in terms of an ingrained format, sponsored stories, promoted tweets, you're really kind of looking at issues related to consent. Are you using someone's name or likeness in the ad? What kind of data are you collecting? The FTC just issued, mobile privacy disclosures for just-in-time disclosures with respect to collecting certain types of data like contacts or geolocation. And then when you get to the other side of the equation, when you're talking about the Atlantic and sort of editorial, it's really about disclosure and much more about, how transparent it is and sort of, aligned with, I'm probably a little bit aligned with Joe's view on that in terms of, the Atlantic probably did everything right in terms of disclosure, but the other side is, are there real, guidelines in terms of editorial versus content, and sort of a question that I can throw out to the guys on the panel is, how is it different from product placement on TV? And, sort of analyzing that, the FCC hasn't really been very strong about disclosure in program. But the FTC has been much more obviously going after that, and that's why you see the sponsor designations now, which come from the FTC endorsement guidelines. So, from my perspective, there's two different buckets of issues, and whether or not you define it as one or the other.
Thank you.
So yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what's been said. You know, on a high level, native ad units essentially are sponsored units that fit the format and style of the site that they appear on. You know, going back to Fred Wilson's talk, where we started this whole conversation, he was talking about a mix of portfolio companies of his and what they were doing in terms of interesting things in monetization. And he was talking about Twitter, and he was talking about Foursquare, and he came up with the term native monetization as an umbrella concept for the very disparate things that these publishers were doing to help brands become part of their experiences. And that was actually something that clicked immediately with share-through as a term and as a concept that we thought was going to be really big. In a lot of ways, it does define sort of non-standard ad units, and that's something that was important, I think, to a lot of companies to be able to have an immediate term to get into the conversation of that they were creating advertising units that were really tailored to their site experience. And so before we even get into sort of the conversation around the editorial native ad units, you can also see like a long history of the internet, the most successful advertising experiences being native. So Google AdWords search results, those are native ad units. Twitter promoted tweets, those are native ad units. Facebook sponsored stories, those are native ad units. They're obviously all very different, but they have that in common, that they follow the format and style of the site that they appear on. And on a high level, the goal is to enhance the experience, right? To connect advertising to users in a way that's going to actually be beneficial to them. So it's quite the opposite of trying to be deceptive. I think a lot of what we are going to talk about, though, is the next phase of native advertising, which is what's happening in the editorial world right now. And publishers thinking differently about both branded content and media units and how they can be more native to their site and kind of be better for both the brand and the users.
Well, thank you. So just to sum up, what I think I heard was there was a little bit of conflict. Ari thinks it's a very specific, either in-stream or specific modules created by publishers. Chris thought it's basically everything that's not a traditional banner ad unit. Vejay had some point of view about disclosure and fair use of people's users' content, and Chris S was a little more in line with Chris C. I want to break from format here because this is an insider crowd and you're all experts on this. And I just want to ask if anybody in the audience has a proper definition that they'd like to throw out. We're going to have some time at the end for Q&A, but if anybody would like to offer a point of view. If not, I just want to say that my own point of view is that it really started with Google. Because when they started displaying search results, it was just content. And the way they delineated the paid from the organic was simply by, shading, the format. And that's where everything grows from here. But I believe the search nomenclature is better. It's paid versus organic. And that the term native is a little confusing, a little deceptive in my opinion. But it's what we have now. So I think it's really important for the industry to establish guidelines and criteria. So for the next part of the discussion, I'd like to ask you all where you think, how explicit do we need to be in terms of, there is no industry guideline right now. There's nothing on the IAB, OPA, ANA, 4As. The only thing that exists relative to this area is the ASME guidelines, which are strictly about advertorials.
Well, I just want to start by saying the second definition that Chris brought up, which is his activity network, is that's good advertising, in my opinion. That's what it is, and it's advertising 2.0, and that's where we all should be headed, and that's where MediaBrix is headed as well. But I think for the purposes of this discussion, it's really challenging to put that in the same bucket as what I think the industry is really focusing on right now, and what Joe's bringing up, which is you don't need to disclose an ad in Activity or an ad in MediaBrix because it looks like an ad. Share-throughs, sponsored content modules or video modules don't necessarily look like an ad. They look like content intentionally. And I think that's where the disclosure question's coming from. And, Chris asked that I understand there's, maybe you don't think there's a perception with mistrust, but I know as a fact there's a lot of research out there that says native ads are misleading. It's just what they are. People don't know that they're actually reading ads versus content, and as a result, I've been in this business for a long time, probably too long, and I know as a fact that you build brands through trust and transparency and relating to them on emotional levels, not by deceiving them. And I think that's where kind of the line is right now. And I think there's nothing wrong with native or nothing wrong with these types of modules. They just have to be set up in a way that it's very clear that I am a brand that I am communicating to with a brand message. If that's whatever, it says advertorial across the top, if it says sponsored content across the top, some sort of standard where people know what it is. And maybe it's some sort of an icon, which kind of takes place in the trustee world, but something along those lines.
Yeah, so I'll let Chris S. speak to the content side because that's not AppSavvy's business. Just taking a step back for the industry, the thing that's exciting about at least the fact that we're having the conversation, it's clearly generated a lot of conversation, is that for the companies that stand by it, it's to move dollars. When there's too many different sides of any equation, it actually kind of puts agencies in paralysis and they get uncomfortable and they're like, wait a second. And really, I think what this movement, if you will, is all about, and I'll call out Solve Media and Ari's company and John Battelle and Federated. The point is, and even AppSavvy, it's not that anyone has actually changed their ad delivery, CAPTCHAs or conversational marketing or AppSavvy, which has always been focused on people and users, but it's more about trying to align some consistency beyond kind of one side of the coin or one side of the path, which is programmatic buying, which is kind of the machines and robots are taking over. And the other side is in my opinion, is more people-centric. It's more about the user. It's more about publishers. It's about timing. It's about context. And those are all, I don't think anyone would dispute that those are important attributes to advertising. And the companies that I've seen that have sort of kind of raised their hand and said, we want to be identified in this bucket are the companies and, friends of mine, other CEOs that I know also care about the advertising experience and the when, because our industry for too long has been focused on the who, and you can have as much information as you want on a user, but to me, that has not proved to deliver the best ad at the right time. And native, the attempt here, the point here, so we don't get sort of lost in or getting kind of scared through attorneys being on panels, things like that, is that this is a format that is trying to promote a better advertising experience, and that no one would dispute that we need to get behind. And if the holding companies can say, got it, there's kind of my programmatic, which half the dollars are going to go that way. Then there's search, video pre-roll is going to get its $4 billion or whatever. Who are the companies that are trying to define a better user experience? And that's the point here, is that this is all about moving dollars. And if we don't have some sense of kind of aggregated group of companies that sort of stand for something, then 15 publishers are going to come in and they're going to tell their story, and the agency is going to be like, it's not MediaBrix, apps, share, and they're going to get it. And everyone's going to win a deal here or there, and everyone probably will be successful in their own definition. But what I'm trying to push, and I've actually reached out to these companies personally to help drive research and to get panels together that have happened at CES and here, and Share Through and AppSavvy and other companies are doing a native panel at the end of February together into iMedia and IAB, is to just try to put a little bit more of a spotlight on better advertising, less about trying to put over too much definition. Right now, let's just start with identifying that this is to take dollars away from Yahoo and AOL and ad.com and ValueClick. Sorry, I actually probably shouldn't call those companies out, but traditional placements. And that's all we're trying to do, because I know one thing that no one will dispute that is on the publisher side. For the one thing I can say comfortably, from I guess speaking on behalf of Ari or Chris and whoever's not here, is that an ad trigger at the right time within context is going to infinitely perform better than a traditional display. That I know. That I don't need to sort of get permission on. So there we're aligned. So quite frankly, I think this effort's more about just taking the dollars away from where they're getting really low performance. So I know that's like the longest answer ever. Hopefully there's still time on the panel for everyone else.
So in terms of where this is headed, we represent a lot of the holding companies and all the media buying agencies, so you need to be a little nicer to me. But as well as publishers and ad techs in the middle. So I really see a 360 on this. But in terms of where it's headed, I think on the editorial side, the FTC is more concerned about consent and privacy right now. So I don't think it's going to be pushed by regulators. I think it's going to be pushed by the industry itself. And even on the privacy side, obviously, with Do Not Track, they're trying to push the industry to do certain things. So I think it's going to be a matter of what guidelines you have internally and how operationally you're working from a business standpoint versus regulators. I do think, from the Federal Trade Commission's standpoint, they still enforce regulation activity in accordance with Section 5, which is general deceptiveness in advertising, which has been around for many, many decades. And the question there is, in terms of disclosure, how you're disclosing that. So clearly under the FTC endorsement guidelines, sponsored post is an obvious one that you have to have. But it's also how is it sort of framed. And, I was talking to some of the panelists about this yesterday and today, and a couple of the examples that, I see that are potentially problematic are sort of, if you look at BuzzFeed, you have Volkswagen is our partner, and that's not really a sponsor designation. And so I think they need to do a little bit better job of disclosure there. And another, example is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Outbrain, but if you read an article, you sort of have the recommended story links at the bottom, and they're next to the sponsor links. And so if you're reading a CNET review and you're thinking about purchasing a product, I think the FTC really looks at purchase intent as an important marker and when they get involved. And if you're reading about a product and then you go to a recommended story, and then at the bottom of that recommended story you realize you just read a product placement ad versus an editorial, I think that can affect your purchasing intent. So the fact that those recommended story links are right next to sponsor links, to me, is potentially generally deceptive. And so I think it's not a matter of you can't do this or it's scary, it's just a matter of how you do it and sort of the framework in which you're working with, whether you're a publisher or an agency or a brand, and sort of how everybody's working together in terms of pushing this to be sort of legally compliant.
Can I ask a quick before Chris? And again, I don't want to defend the content side because that's not our core business. But the only question I have for you is, as it relates to Facebook's business, and even through sponsored stories, which is content driven, and arguably, even though the market would say they're not doing well, you could say that their mobile revenues has grown sort of tenfold. They've gone kind of 0 to 320 million in the last 18 months. And sponsored stories is content driven, and BuzzFeed, from my perspective, probably has the kind of buzz that we had as a company in 9 and 10, which is a very exciting kind of point, meaning there's a lot of appetite. So my disconnect is based on sort of those guidelines and those points, which makes sense. Those companies are technically winning in the category of agencies and brands and dollars spent and users and kind of just overall growth. So how can you help sort of define that sort of those guidelines and the perceptual challenges versus the fact that those businesses are growing and winning dollars, and agencies are excited about what they're doing?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a growing atmosphere in terms of what's the holy grail of marketing. Your friend recommends something to you, and therefore you now feel like you have a much more credible source to go purchase that product. And it's just a matter of whether or not that's transparent enough. And so the guidelines are pretty clear in terms of having a disclosure that's connected to the post. If you're looking at a sponsored story or promoted tweet, I think there's not really a disclosure issue because those are pretty designated in terms of disclosure. It's more about consent, right? So if you're putting a name and likeness of a person in an ad and you're incorporating that, you have seen that a lot more. You've seen it through hashtags. You've seen it through a lot of the activity. But Facebook is currently, settling a class action on sponsored stories, and you're going to see when they, sort of implement that there's going to be sort of a more consent-driven environment with respect to those types of ads, right? So, whether if you're not using user-generated content, you're not using, username likeness, copyright, trademarks, you're not using other people's content as you would in a TV commercial, you'd still clear all that stuff, then there's not as much risk. Right? And on the behavioral side, again, regulators are trying to push people to sort of self-regulate. And so, you may see privacy legislation, particularly on the mobile side. You may see from Congress, although you don't see anything from Congress, you may see that. You may see it from the FTC, but, they've had some admin changes recently, and the mobile privacy disclosures are the last thing that they've done. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but sort of, gives you a good perspective as what sort of the landscape is. And again, I think it's going to be pushed more by businesses and marketers, at least for now, versus regulators who'd rather not really push it as hard.
I just have one thing about the winning, which is interesting to me because I feel like BuzzFeed's winning and maybe AppSavvy and MediaBrix are winning and even ShareThrough's winning. Frankly, because agencies are looking for a new solution because the industry's broken. IAB standard ads don't work. Everybody knows that. There's banner blindness. People click away from pre-roll. So I think solutions that are kind of non-traditional, I'm not calling them native, I'm just calling them non-traditional, are working right now because there's no other solutions out there that are working. So agencies are clamoring for a solution, and it just so happens that if we can figure out what that solution is, to Chris's point, he's trying to create some sort of consortium to talk about it on a higher level, that's the right direction, because that's why companies that are up on this panel are winning right now, because, and frankly, the reason Facebook Mobile's winning is because that's where there's, 400 million people there, and they only have one ad unit, so that ad unit's gonna win because every marketer believes that's where they need to be. But anyway, I'm sorry, Chris S., you've been held at bay.
That's good. I think I wanted to echo an earlier point Chris was making before, which was just the correlation between the native advertising approach and user experience. Google, Twitter, Facebook, all of them, user experience is held paramount. And it's something consistent, I think, it's why they developed native ad products, because they wanted to create an experience that was going to work with their platform. And obviously, deception is going to be the opposite of a positive user experience. So that's not something that they're going to want to do. And I guess the point I wanted to make, I guess I lost my train of thought a little bit on that one. But I want to talk a little bit about ShareThrough, I guess, personally, in terms of where we come from it. So we got into the business of video advertising because we saw an opportunity to do this completely differently. We saw a lot of interesting content on the creative side being made that really went beyond anything we had seen before from traditional commercials. And we saw pre-roll as really the largest market and saw a very kind of negative user experience. It was a forced interruption. It was very limiting creatively. And so I think ShareThrough is a perfect example of sort of how something has evolved very organically to create a better user experience with a more interesting creative unit as well, taking interruption out of the process and creating a more seamless design. So, this conversation I think is excellent because it shows that we are all thinking about the most important things here, which is to think about the user first, to not go so far as to have any type of deception involved, to clearly label things as sponsored, but also to think differently, right? Not just accept standards, but actually help the web evolve, help advertisers evolve the way they're communicating and entertaining people.
Okay, so first I want to nominate Chris C. for the Native Advertising Bureau. So I heard in this last discussion that it's about the dollars, but it's also about the user experience. So I just want to follow up on the user experience, and this is the last slippery slope question, and then we could get into some nuts and bolts. But, Vijay, you used to be in network TV standards and practices. When I started out in this industry, there were very strict guidelines about what you could do and you couldn't do. Bill Cosby's Jell-O commercials could not appear in the Cosby Show. Today, that is considered a best practice. It's brand integration on television. And what I'm wondering is if we keep going at this rate because of the need to create more creative experiences, the more advertising, performance dollars, how far can we go? And where is the demarcation? When does it just become entropy?
You asking me?
Yeah, well, let me give you one example. So one of the most interesting formats I've seen was the one created by Empowered, which is the NetShelter folks. And there are other formats like this, but where it will semantically grab user content, like if it's a Samsung tweet or a post about my wonderful new Galaxy, we'll pull it into an ad module that will appear on pages relevant to the user, right? So conceivably in that model, you could target yourself with your own tweet. That's like silly.
From an entertainment perspective, I worked as business legal affairs at a cable network, and product placement on television, like you said, is just rampant. And I think it's become very clear to the user, though, through understanding what they're watching, that it's there and that they see it. And so I don't necessarily know that, disclosure is as key. You'll see promotional consideration by the end credits of a TV show, and you probably aren't watching at that point unless you're in the credits, right? So, it hasn't really been regulated in the way that some people want it to be on television. There was a strong push for, real screen disclosures, and it just hasn't been regulated that way. In terms of online, I think you will continue to see it. I think you'll see it more and more, whether, you can kind of liken it to, I do a lot of added value media buy deals on TV, so you'll see, an interstitial, right, in between programming, and sort of that's, product integration within that like dinner and a movie, for example, on TBS. I think you'll start to see continuous added value media buys with print and editorial as well, and I think it'll continue. I think it's just a matter of, again, how you do that, right? So, if you're operationally and editorially in sync in terms of, the format is different, it's clear that it's advertising. I think it's more important online than it is on TV, because I think on TV it's a little more evident. So,
well, Ari, you did some research on user experience. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I did. And this, everybody says you do research to support your company. This is in no way, it was not self-serving. I was getting a little frustrated. I came from the ad agency side early on. I did client-side marketing, and then I worked on the publisher side. I worked at Condé Nast, Hearst, and Yahoo, and DoubleClick, all on the digital publisher side. And when native became hot, I just was like, I don't get it. I don't get what, when I was at Portfolio.com back in the day, we had sponsored content modules. That was native. It had a hot new name because Fred Wilson was behind it, and there was VCs behind it, and they wanted to make it succeed. So we did some research. We asked over 2,000 internet users, and we actually gave in context examples of a promoted tweet, of a sponsored story, of a sponsored video, and even showed advertorials in magazines. And overwhelmingly, people found those ads to be misleading and not add to the user experience. So to me, it's beneficial to the brands, and it's beneficial to the publishers. It's not beneficial to the users. And I think that's really where it has to go, is creating ads that are beneficial to users. Back to Chris's point on his definition of native, which I don't consider native, but it's frankly better advertising, which is what we have to focus on. I'd ask Chris S. this question because I saw the Forbes story where I think you guys have a video. Is it you guys that did the video module inside Forbes?
Yeah. Well, we work with Forbes.
So I saw that, and I think there was a couple stories on it. I might have been a MediaPost story, and I'm having a hard time understanding how that's beneficial to a user. I understand how it's beneficial to Forbes and how it's beneficial to you and how it might be beneficial to the brand. How is it beneficial to the user to have a unit that literally looks like its content sitting on the homepage of Forbes?
Well, anything we would do would be labeled as sponsored content, so there's nothing misleading about it. I think, relative to a lot of the advertising options that you have online, think about what you're doing. You're removing interruption from the process. With us, we work with brands who are creating content, so if you click play, you're going to watch something that a brand created from a content perspective. It's not necessarily just trying to put a 30-second commercial out there. So I actually think across the board, it's an evolution of advertising. It's choice-based, it's an interesting creative, and it's visually integrated, but it's labeled as sponsored.
There's labeling. The ASME guidelines are very specific about font size and placement, and I see all kinds of versions in native. Should there be industry standards for this?
I think we're getting too tactical out of the gate. I think the first thing it's to grow a space and a market, and really what this is. So the first thing is, so people's behavior has shifted. It used to be about passive content consumption. People don't do that as much today. They are more active. They're activity driven, which is the core of our business. We're not going to change our name to a native company. We're aligned with the ecosystem, but our business is activity driven. It's what people do. And beyond app savvy, so it's not self-serving, just what people are doing online has shifted. It's checking in, it's tweeting, it's commenting, obviously the rise of social gaming and all those different activities in those environments. So people's behavior has shifted. However, the technology stack has not. The technology stack was founded in '97 by a company called DoubleClick, which has done fine, but that's based on pages and impressions. And pages and impressions are the wrong metric to track advertising, yet that's how the agencies buy media. So you have people's behavior shifted, you have the buying mechanisms have not, and what we have always stood for and will continue to stand for is how do we best align with the publishers that are focused on the user experience. So that's definitely a consistent theme that I think everyone's trying to figure out, to take much more of a Silicon Valley approach, which has worked for companies like Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and Pinterest, who categorically would never put anything in the way of their business except the user experience. But there's a gap to capture in dollars to make up for the fact that there's so many people. So what we need as an industry today is innovation and disruption around better ad placements and timing based on what people do. Just a basic statement, which I don't think is that difficult to digest. And right now is an opportunity to help brands and agencies identify the companies that are fundamentally trying to improve and make advertising more effective.
I don't know how you can consider disclosure tactical, but I'll take that as a no for standards. Does anybody else think we need
I just
standards?
decided to move on from the disclosure piece.
I kind of agree with Chris in terms of it becoming more and more interactive and people sharing more and more content. And I think, I worked on the White and Old Spice campaign a while back, and, we took the position that, the actor talking to celebrities and talking to people directly on those YouTube videos made sense because they reached out by a tweet and they wanted to sort of have that interaction. And so, I think you will see that more. Instagram's a really good example of kind of where legal and business kind of didn't mix well, which is, Instagram has to find a way to monetize, and, they needed to find a way to start to do sort of what Facebook does with sponsored stories, but yet they buried this stuff in their legal terms and people went nuts. And so if they actually rolled that out in a different way and actually communicated that effectively prior to changing those terms of use, which is what we would have certainly advised, because you don't want to bury stuff in a terms of use or a privacy policy anymore. You want to be much more transparent in terms of, simply communicating that information. I think you'll find users willing to share that information more, than they're not. And I think, we saw a lot of 18 to 24-year-olds yesterday talk about this, and they want relevant ads. They want to interact, but they don't want to be tricked or deceived, and they get pissed. And so, that to me makes sense.
And just one last thing, Joe, that I called out earlier, I just want to call out again. The user sort of, they vote on what they think of ads based on how they perform, interact, watch, view. And at the end of the day, that should be a big part of what this conversation should be, which is, does native, whether we're calling them native ad format, I think we all understand kind of definition, whether we're agreeing on the term native. Let's just move on. But the point is are the companies that are sitting in this ecosystem, do they perform better than what's out there today? And the answer is categorically yes, hands down, probably 5 to 15x. So if more people are watching your video, liking your page, interacting, engaging, or the infamous click-through rate, then that should tell you that these sorts of ad formats are better than what's out in the market. And that's what this conversation is all about. It's just in creating another pocket of companies that have a better performing unit than where there's billions of dollars being probably misspent.
All right, I don't think we agreed on what the definition of it is, but Chris?
Well, I guess to both points. So totally agree with Chris in terms of performance and performance metrics that really matter here in terms of, like, we're not talking about just better click-through rate, because then you could kind of come at it from a few different angles, but we are talking about higher sharing, higher brand lift, things that reflect that users are having a better experience with the advertising unit. So I do think in a lot of cases native is showing just perform better in terms of users receiving it better and engaging with it better. But also to your earlier question about standardization, that's a really important thing for this market to have as a very consistent piece of the conversation. Obviously, all of us know things move very fast, though, and so that's the concern: is can standards keep up with how quickly things are changing formats and platforms? And so, that's why we have things like the IAB, and that's why we have
But they haven't weighed in on it, so.
No, but this is new. They definitely will have a lot more involvement in next year than they did last year.
No, they have weighed in on it.
Randall weighed in.
No, Randall categorically, who's personal friend. He doesn't. His position is that native can't scale, and I think today that's kind of fair. Even though I mean I think a lot of companies that are out there today will say, hey, we reach 200 million people. And I said this at CES, maybe the question of scale is the wrong question. Maybe our definition of scale is absolutely incorrect because too much supply and bad impressions actually don't yield us much. Maybe we need to actually redefine that a little bit. But ultimately, for a conversation that just started a few months ago, there's no way that you can just force standards in it immediately.
That's fair. Maybe people in the audience have some opinion on this. And
my mic back off?
You're on.
There we go. Okay, they definitely have an opinion on Twitter, I'll tell you that. So does anybody want to go public? You already did on Twitter. Okay. So here's
I'm not like one of those college kids where I can look over my shoulder and watch the Twitter
No, he had
feed.
he had eyes in the back of his head. That was his trick. So I'm actually going to take Dave Ralla's question. Dave is our next moderator, by the way. It just is just kind of a fun one. He said, what if Facebook sponsored stories were called sponsored ads? Would that affect performance? I thought that was a great question. Does anybody want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, it's almost like double speak. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So sponsored stories versus sponsored ads.
Yeah. What if they call it sponsored ads?
Yeah, I mean, it probably would. There probably would potentially be an inverse impact on performance, but potentially, it's a good. Whoever asked us, that is a good question. But clearly, they're a very smart company, Facebook. So there must have been some rhyme or reason on how they landed on it, and it's their number one ad. It's the ad product that they're putting the most emphasis into. So they didn't call it sponsored ads.
Well, I mean, the rhyme or reason is that they wanted people to believe that it was content. I mean, that's the ultimate goal of what they were trying to do.
I mean, everyone's sharing their lives on Facebook, right? So a story is your life versus an ad, right? You don't really want to tell a story about an ad. You want to tell a story about your life. So
Just like corporations.
right, exactly. And the brands want to
and
interact
brands are
in that
journalists
personal
too,
way with
right?
people.
Right.
So
Right.
And maybe if we didn't have the last 10 years of sort of false hopes and a lot of broken dreams and we've kind of hit the abyss, maybe they would have come out, if there wasn't so much of a history, they would have come out with sponsored ads. But they probably looked at it more as trying to redefine it because the general perception of advertising is poor as an industry, right? That's just reality. So
Digital advertising.
digital advertising. So the overall macro perception from Thanksgiving and talking to your mom or family or here is that digital advertising, So, but if there wasn't the last 10 years of sort of bad banners, perhaps if you said sponsored ad, because there wasn't so much, kind of missteps, it would be an effective way of delivering their ad product.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Like they're actively trying to redefine advertising.
Exactly.
And sponsored stories, I think they're really trying to live up to that name. They're not just trying to give it a separate name and then do the same old thing that everyone else has been doing.
Yeah, but the story depends a lot on the content, and that's always an iffy proposition.
Can I just throw one out from Stephan
Yeah, sure,
Gross,
sure.
who wasn't able to be here? I said I'd bring some of his points out, and he was talking largely about best practices and what you should and should not do. And one of the examples he gave of the worst case scenario, and this is a good example of unintended consequences, is the dead friend scenario on a Facebook-sponsored newsfeed, which is, it's happened to me. An old industry colleague, Gene DeWitt, who created DeWitt Media, which is part of Optum Media now. Every once in a while, I get a little plug from him. He's dead.
Right.
Okay.
You can't end a panel on that comment, Joe. That's just fucked.
Right, right, yeah. It's social media from beyond the grave. It's a whole new. We're going to do a themed conference on it, actually. So I guess just I like 1 minute answer, right? But and maybe this is a question for Vejay. Obviously, we talked about regulation a bit, and I'm like sitting here going, who should be the one to drive that bus?
I mean, I think I talked about that a little bit. I think again the sort of regulators are looking at privacy and consent a little more right now than they're looking at content.
Well, if it's an industry, entity, who gets to drive that bus? Not, hopefully the government would
The
be involved.
IAB has to step in at some point, but they also have to embrace non-standard IAB formats as part of what the future is of advertising.
I think that makes sense.
And I said this to Joe, I think last night. The initial quick reaction of privacy and sort of it's almost like it's human. It's like American human nature. It kills me. It's like user-generated content 6 years ago. Massive panic attacks around it, and everything we do today is user-generated, and everyone's fine with. Everyone in this room has done something user-generated in the last 24 hours, but 6 years ago there was an assumption it was porn, and today we're jumping quickly on sort of privacy and all. The human reaction or nature, unfortunately, is they don't like change. People don't like change. They challenge change, and this is a time where there needs to be some change. So generally, there's going to be a lot of unnatural, knee-jerk lawyers and guidelines. And right now, it's like just let a better ad format sort of grow and evolve because we need it.
Yeah, I mean, from a regular standpoint, I don't think they're doing that. I think they have been pushing the industry to do things themselves. I think where they're active is, children, financial information, health information, sensitive information. I think they get that this is the way the world is going to be. I just think they want it to be a certain way with respect to that kind of information that can so easily jump out of someone's hands, even if they inadvertently disclose that, or they didn't expect. For example, Path just paid $800,000. Because they took your contact information, but that wasn't that wasn't disclosed in a transparent way. And they also had, I think it was like 1 million PII of kids under 13, and they weren't COPA compliant. And so I think regulators are kind of hitting the more sensitive areas versus trying to kind of blanket the entire industry with rules, which isn't, from an economic standpoint, going to make sense anyway for the growing digital industry. So.
Okay, well, thanks, guys.
Can I say one
yes.
more thing?
Yes, Joe, I won't cut you off.
If anybody needs a ride back to Fort Myers Airport, I'm leaving at noon. So
I'm leaving at 1, so it's me or Joe. Take your pick. Okay, thanks, guys. Nothing like a good native advertising discussion to get some controversy going. So our next group can come up.